Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Driving across these wide open spaces gave me time to reflect and unwind. It was just another typical day in my life, or so I thought, but I ended up stopping at Blackbeard Diner just to enjoy a little peace and quiet as I drove through rural Kansas on a tree-lined highway. My name is Troy Hendricks, and I work as a truck driver. Outside of Wichita, I was in familiar territory because I had traveled this route countless times before. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, and I struck up conversations with a few other truckers while enjoying my well-earned meal. Shortly after leaving the diner, I felt uneasy, like a heavy blanket trying to anchor me down despite its weight. I forced myself to keep going and returned to the highway a few miles out of town, where before I could even think about my choice, I saw someone coming up behind the broken-down car, intending to flag me down. The man had a slight limp, but he managed to get closer. The cell phone reception was barely hanging on by a thread. I saw an old sedan parked by the side of the road with its hood up. It was not unusual to see an unfortunate soul suffering from car troubles out here in the middle of nowhere. You can never be too cautious around strangers. This man's unkempt beard covered half of his face, and his clothes were smeared with dirt. My truck slowed down close to him, but before it stopped entirely, I asked him aloud from the window what help he needed, and he told me that he had blown out. I hesitated for a moment, weighing the pros and cons of the situation, but my conscience and his apparent desperation won out. I got out of my truck and approached the seemingly broken-down vehicle. The man eyed me cautiously from head to toe, but his eyes had an unsettling glint. Tire needed help changing it for his spare one. That made me shiver. We had a quick introduction, and he gave me his name, but I suspected it wasn't his real one. While we were changing the tire, this man kept raising red flags with his erratic behavior, rubbing and wringing his hands as though he was really worried about something. At one point, he vanished back into his car and came out with hours past, or at least that's how it felt under the pressure of this man's unsettling presence. But at last the tires were changed, and I had accomplished my good deed for the day, or so I thought. Rather than driving away, as anyone would normally do in this situation, the stranger stood there for what seemed like an eternity before saying something that made me shudder. "You might want to get out." It took me a moment to comprehend what he was saying, but as I gradually started to realize the seriousness of what he was implying, I felt a huge pit form in my stomach. Without asking me for an explanation or even asking me to do anything, he got into his car and drove off as if his life depended on it, and perhaps it did, leaving me alone on the desolate, as much as I wanted to leave everything behind and move on from this terrifying experience. The highway, with darkness creeping in and an impending storm quickly approaching, only made me more anxious. Curiosity overcame me as tree branches creaked their sinister symphony and the stifled wind whispered its ominous tales. I clambered back into my cab, feeling as though there was a raging fire inside of me, but before I knew it, the temperature, and I could see a figure emerging from the shadows. A tall, muscular man with a disheveled appearance, his hair wild and unkempt, dirt and dried blood smeared on his face, and the chilling expression in his eyes was that of a predator focused on its prey. My truck crashed, frozen tendrils coiled around my throat, and an icy grip gripped my body, making it nearly impossible for me to move. I was paralyzed by the man's intimidating presence, which included clenched fists and gritted teeth. I managed to lunge for the door handle and lock it, but as he got to my truck, He tried to open it, but realized it was locked. The man approached, with deliberate steps, each one bringing him closer to sealing my fate. As the assailant grabbed a rock from the side of the road and lifted it menacingly above his head, his rage grew. If only I could call someone, like my friends or the police, but my phone seemed so far away in this nightmare world. Every survival instinct cried out for me to do anything to protect myself in that moment of pure terror. Even though I felt powerless and trapped at the mercy of this maned man, I recalled a crucial detail. My truck key has a panic button. Using all of my remaining strength, I reached out to the keychain dangling precariously from the ignition and pressed down on the panic button. Immediately, the truck's alarm blared loudly and the headlights flashed quickly on and off, and the attacker flinched away from the unexpected noise and appeared confused for a moment, which gave me the ideal opportunity to flee. With my heart thumping hard against my chest, I opened the driver's side door and threw myself out of the car, barely staying upright. I ran down the highway, ignoring the stinging pain in my legs and the labored breathing that burned my lungs. I had to get help. The man attacked me on my truck, and I stammered, pointing the attendant toward the highway, where the predator still lurked in search of his next victim. I managed to survive by running for what seemed like miles before finally spotting a dimly lit building ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a small gas station with an attendant working inside. Relief washed over me as I entered, barely able to speak through my wheezing and gasping for air. As we waited for law enforcement to arrive, the victims, attendant acted quickly, picking up the phone and dialing 911, while also locking the door. The arrival of police cars with flashing lights broke through the darkness like rays of hope, and they asked me a lot of questions about what had happened, wanting to know every detail about the attacker and the location where I had encountered them. Given the situation and degree of danger, they were very cautious, but genuinely concerned about my safety. When they discovered my truck abandoned on the side of the road, they escorted me back there to collect my belongings. When they arrived at the scene, they found that my tire had been purposefully slashed, and that there were blood traces close to the broken rock. The grim result of a sinister attack interrupted a manhunt for as life gradually returned to its normal pace following those horrific and gory events. My thoughts frequently turned to those who suffered at his hands, those whose lives were irrevocably changed by a chance encounter with a violent human predator, carefully concealed beneath a facade of desperation and violence. The vicious attacker, and within days he was apprehended. It seemed he had been responsible for multiple other assault cases. Victor Kenley was driving his big rig across the country, carrying a load of electronics from Chicago to Los Angeles, eager to get some serious miles under my belt before stopping for the night. It was just another typical day for me, helpless, and the sun had already started to set as I pulled into a. I made a respectable living as a truck driver in Groom, Texas, but that didn't mean I lived the glamorous life. The truck stop diner was crowded with sour travelers on a seemingly endless stretch of desolate road, and as I sat by the window and drank my steaming black coffee, I tried to think of something upbeat to lift my spirits, like how I finally got all those tomato stains off my favorite shirt. As I continued eating, I noticed a group of local teenagers gathered outside by the smoking area. They were all excited as one of them described what sounded like a grisly and grotesque scene they had seen earlier that day. A poor guy who had been found near that same highway, his body badly mangled and his skin bluish. Geez, what is this world coming? I decided it would be best to get back on the road and make plans to sleep somewhere more populated as my appetite diminished and their words sunk in, leaving my leftovers on the plate. As dusk completely descended and darkness engulfed my surroundings, I was driving along the highway when I suddenly encountered massive traffic jams that caused me to slow down to a crawl and eventually overturn. Vehicles blocked all lanes in front of them while emergency personnel cleared the debris. I was uneasy about this sudden development because it was so closely related to recent grisly stories. Back at the stopping room, I realized that perhaps This wasn't a coincidence, and I wasn't being overly suspicious. After an hour of stuck traffic, I realized I desperately needed a bathroom break and had nowhere to go. So I grabbed a flashlight, got out of my truck, and went to the bushes next to the road. It was eerily quiet as I left the highway, but in the middle of my relief, I heard rustling in the leaves. I turned my flashlight to see what was causing the noise, and my blood ran cold when I saw a dirty man with matted hair and crazy eyes, staring right at me. Before I could even react, he charged at me. Neck speed, but abruptly stumbled and fell short just inches away. His left hand held a huge hunting knife that was dripping with fresh blood, and in an instant I realized I was in danger. In danger. Without waiting another second, I ran back towards my rig, my heart racing as I went, and as I got closer to the truck, I fumbled with as I finally succeeded in opening the door and hurried inside. I thought, keys are desperately trying to unlock the door. Why isn't anybody else realizing what's going on? People were still stuck in their cars, some of them visibly frustrated, while others appeared resigned to wait out the traffic jam. I looked back and saw the horrifying man in hot pursuit, with a crazed expression on his. This man's face further unsettled me. He was obviously unstable and appeared determined to harm anyone who happened to cross his path. Panicked, I began honking my horn frantically to call attention to the threat that was now directly outside my door. To my relief, other people noticed the disturbance and started honking their horns as well, and the eerie silence was broken by a clamor of horns that seemed to confuse and disorient the attacker. So I took advantage of my opportunity and carefully moved my rig off the road and onto the shoulder. As more people saw the insane man still holding his knife, blood dripping from its sharp edges, they began yelling at him, and two brave bystanders approached him cautiously while yelling for help and trembling uncontrollably. I quickly reported what had happened to 911. The operator told me that a patrol car was already en route because of reports of an aggressive person threatening drivers who were stuck in traffic. Within minutes, sirens sounded and police cars screeched up behind us, encircling Ed the assailant with their guns drawn and ordering him to drop his weapon and surrender. The man unexpectedly realized what had happened. My heart was still racing from the adrenaline rush. I stood there feeling thankful to be alive, but I couldn't help but think of those poor teenagers who had discovered the terrible aftermath of the attacker's actions. I felt a pang of sympathy for them. Eventually, he complied and threw the blood-stained knife to the ground. The officers caught him without any more violence, and a paramedic team arrived on the scene to treat anyone who might have been hurt in the chaos. In the days that followed, I discovered more about the attacker, a local man with a history of mental instability who had apparently snapped without any provocation. According to multiple victims, they realized that true evil was much closer than they could have ever imagined. So I stayed on the scene to give my statement to the police before being allowed to leave. But even though I was free to leave, I knew that this experience would stay with me forever. His vicious rampage was discovered by the side of the road not far from where I had met him, and every graphic detail that came to light made me even more grateful that I had survived such a horrific experience. It was a terrifying reminder that life was short and could be taken away at any time, and in spite of everything that had happened, I decided not to let that terrible experience consume me or tame my view of the world, but rather it reaffirmed the value of life and reminded me to always treasure each moment. The faces of those innocent souls who died too soon will always be remembered, and their tragic passing served as a sobering reminder that, despite humanity's innate goodness, evil may still lurk, waiting for a chance to. I'm Gordon Mallister, and I've been a truck driver. Before this strike, I didn't think of myself as superstitious, the person who reads urban myths or looks at the horoscope every morning for guidance from celestial beings. For me, life was more about the open road and the purr of my semi-truck engine as I drove through every bend and turn in this huge country of ours. For 15 years, One day, I took a road trip that sent me slogging from Des Moines to Charlottesville, Virginia. It was a straightforward route, really just your average job for any experienced truck driver. After stopping in hot Indiana for a quick snack and refuel, I got back behind the wheel and resumed my journey as evening began to creep over the horizon and the picturesque hues of sunset began to fade into the sky. On this lengthy stretch of road, another driver swiftly passed me by and strangely slowed down directly in front of my rig. It was an older sedan that was seeing better days, but even so, I was in the middle of the night with miles to go before arriving at my destination when the wind howled through branches above headlights, somehow maintained momentum along this lonely section of highway from where I was seated high above in my cab, making it difficult to see its occupant. For several miles, we obstinately followed each other like two pack animals heading to a shared destination, despite obviously maintaining our distance from one another. Their behavior swiftly changed from annoying to dangerous, with abrupt swerves and sharp turns forcing me to as we continued down the highway. My uneasiness increased, so I forced myself to look into the car's windows when it sped past me on a straight stretch, but they were tinted to darkly. At first, I laughed at their erratic behavior, thinking they were drunk college students or attention-seeking teenagers trying to agitate an elderly man like me. Eventually, my breaking point came when they slammed on there. My heart was racing as I thought about my options after brakes forced me and my rumbling 18-wheeler to a screeching halt. Calling the police seemed like the obvious choice, but as I waited for the authorities to arrive, I considered the harm this person could do to others, so I mustered the courage to get out of my taxi and confront them. As I got closer, I could see that he was breathing heavily, and that there were spakes of what appeared to be blood smeared across his cheeks and jawline. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a person hidden in the shadowy darkness. The windshield wipers slashed away at the sheets of rain pouring from the menacing storm cloud CLS above, leaving only fleeting glimpses of him. The rain was still falling steadily, blending with this painting of crimson fluid. This man wasn't your average road rager or drunken fool trying to achieve online fame, as I finally realized after seeing this sickening picture that made my throat turn up. He stared at me with an unnerving level of laser-focused intensity that sent a new wave of dread through my veins like ice water, replacing every ounce of courage that had first driven me towards him. A brief smirk crossed his face, blooded lips as if he knew something I didn't know that thrilled him beyond comprehension, possibly another victim soon to be added to his collection, or possibly a terrible secret he'd reveal. Later, when we'd parted ways, I considered calling for assistance or handling the situation myself, but the man's unpredictable behavior and the fact that he had already forced us to stop on a desolate highway made calling it felt dangerous and time-consuming. To ask for help, and I muttered, "What the hell do you want?" The enigmatic man simply cocked his head, his dark eyes narrowing as he watched me, and then lunged at me, obviously determined to hurt me. I moved to the side out of instinct, but stumbled and fell onto the wet asphalt. The man smiled evilly as he raised a fearful. I scurried to my feet and ran back towards my truck, frantically searching my pockets for my cell phone as I ran. Once inside the cab, I locked all the doors and called 911, explaining my ordeal in quick, panicked breaths. The dispatcher assured me that help was on its way, but the minutes felt like hours as I kept my eyes fixed on the screen. The enigmatic man who stalked around my truck had a twisted visage of hatred and malice on his face, but he was strangely expressionless and blank despite being covered in rainwater. His disheveled hair was still stiff from what looked like dried blood, and his clothes were an old-fashioned black suit with red-brown stains on it, not the kind of clothes one would expect from someone who was allegedly on a murderous mission. Rampage's face changed drastically as he saw the approaching police cars, turning from sadistic glee to pure rage. He gave me one last death glare through the windshield before retreating into his car and starting the engine before speeding away. I was cowering in fear in the cabin of my truck, waiting for help, when I felt a wave of relief as flashing blue lights approached quickly in the distance. The police gave chase, and their sirens off into the night, and eventually they faded in the distance. I was left to process what had happened, and a number of questions tormented my mind. Who was that man? What had precipitated his violent behavior? And where had he vanished to? After the ordeal was over and I was back on the road, I couldn't help but remember the faces of when I realized that there were people like that man out there viciously hunting down unsuspecting victims for reasons beyond comprehension. It was a constant reminder to be ever vigilant in an unpredictable world. Would there be more people who might have been his previous victims? Could they be found and given proper burials? Or would they forever remain nameless and forgotten as I continued my journey? Well, because there were no assurances regarding one's safety, and that terrible experience turned into a painful memory that I hope to never relive, but it made me appreciate life and people around me even more. I was feeling optimistic as I sipped my morning coffee and laughed at some goofy memes that appeared on my social media feed because I work as a truck driver. Had a rather boring life. I'll admit that I wasn't the most interesting person to talk to at parties, but I liked this easy routine. After filling up at a dilapidated gas station, I continued traveling through Pine Valley, California, which seemed to go on forever. It was strange for me, because normally there would be other cars on this section of highway, but today it was eerily quiet, like as I passed an old, abandoned farmhouse off the highway in a ghost town. A sickly sweet stench filled my nostrils. My gut told me something was wrong, but I was pressed for time and couldn't afford to be late. I told myself it must have been some roadkill or rotten trash. Shortly after, I noticed a silver sedan on the side of the road with its headlights on, and a man came up to me and waved for assistance as my truck grudgingly slowed down. The goo appeared to be of average height, standing at about 5 feet 10, with brown hair and pale skin, dressed simply, but there was something strange about his eyes. They had a scary glint. "You need help?" I asked hesitantly as he stood close to my truck window. "Yeah," he panted. "I got a flat tire and my jack isn't working correctly." "Do you have one, please?" replied. Jack doesn't fit regular cars. It was true that I had equipment specifically for my truck's needs, and he seemed strangely irritated by this response. He walked back to his vehicle without saying anything else. Seeing his reaction confirmed my suspicion that ism was wrong to stop in the first place, and I continued on my path because I couldn't get rid of the smell in particular. From earlier, it blended with the memory of the strange man's intense stare. I trusted my gut and pulled off onto a dirt lane, parking behind a thick tree line to provide some cover. I called 911 for assistance, and a calm voice answered. I confessed that I wasn't sure if it was an emergency, but there was a silver sedan on Highway 80 with a man in it, who might be in need of assistance. Asked me for help, but he seemed very strange when I couldn't give it. Now that he's waiting there, the operator told me they would send a patrol officer and told me to wait until they got there, feeling like I had fulfilled my civic duty. I waited patiently in my truck and distractedly browsed through my phone until I noticed movement outside when I caught a glimpse of the man from the sedan. He had discovered me, and his furious sprint looked remarkably determined. Panicked, I fumbled with my keys to restart my truck, while the stranger snarled, "You can't just mind your own business," as he forced open the passenger door, blood splattering off his hands. I was frozen in terror. How could this be? My mind raced as I tried to figure out how to get out of the situation. With the truck running, despite my crippling fear, I put it in reverse and headed for the thick bushes behind me. The stranger clung on as I processed what was happening. The stench from earlier filled the cabin. It was human decay, the same smell that occurred when blood started to purify. I didn't stop until I felt the impact of the wooded area jolt us. The man was momentarily confused by the crash, so I took advantage of the moment and opened my door. racing out of my truck and racing towards a small cabin that was visible from the road. I banged fiercely on its door, thankfully alight, while his fingers dug desperately into the dashboard and his eyes were wild with rage. We frantically locked all entry points and hid away from windows in case we tried calling 911 again. Just as we were about to report our location, our connection dropped, and we were unwilling to leave the safety of the cabin. I explained everything to the concerned man, who answered quickly and ushered me inside without hesitation. It felt more secure behind closed doors. Minutes passed like hours, while we anxiously awaited a signal or any indication of help. Suddenly, we heard a police siren outside, which was both reassuring and unsettling. As the siren screamed closer, we heard menacing footsteps circling the cabin and the characteristic sound of blood dripping on the ground. The uniformed officer cautiously entered our sanctuary, after knocking on the door and verifying his identity. He let us know that a backup unit with an AK-9 unit was arriving to look for the assailant, and that he had discovered an unsettling scene. Back at my truck, the grim discovery of a mutilated body in the silver sedan's trunk. At last, he realized that another victim had been present during my prior encounter with this twisted individual, and things began to make sense to me. The strange odor wasn't caused by the attacker. Rather, it was the decaying remains of another human being. The horrific realization came a bit too late, but it confirmed why I had called 911 in the first place. The officers caught the murderer, who was found guilty of kidnapping and murder on several counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release, and the terrifying reports described his gory acts. I silently thanked my instincts. I'm grateful to the stranger in the cabin who gave me refuge that day, and to all the police officers who responded to my frantic call for assistance, because, despite my physical and mental trauma from the terrible experience, I was unable to comprehend how close I came to becoming another victim in his twisted game. Life went on, but not without paranoia. We all knew that we could never completely remove that dark chapter from our collective history, but we acknowledged its significance in bringing us together to share our grief and a renewed awareness of potential threats, no matter how terrifying they were, in remembrance of the innocent lives taken by this psychotic man. Our small town held a memorial service honoring their memories and consoling one another. Having such intimate contact with evil altered my perspective on life and increased my appreciation for each day. While nightmares may occur, one thing has become evident: trusting my instincts is essential when it comes to survival, and sometimes that decision makes all the difference. On a warm Tucson, Arizona evening, I was just wrapping up my shift. When I got out of my truck, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurd bumper sticker that said, "There's nothing better than bad coffee in a long road ahead." As a truck driver, my name is Frederick Whitmore, which isn't your typical name around here. At first, everything seemed normal, but just before I heard the distinct sound of someone crying close to my truck. It was Marjorie, the new team member who had just started last week. She had her phone clutch. My first instinct was to call for help, but when I realized that Margie might not want anyone else involved in her personal life, I decided to hold off on talking to her. "What's wrong?" I asked, holding her tightly to her chest, her eyes red with tears, and she tried to speak in hushed tones. As I got closer, she barely managed to mutter something about her brother, but the words just wouldn't come out clearly. When I handed Margie's phone back to her, she blinked back tears and showed me a picture of what appeared to be a disfigured human hand covered in deep cuts and bruises. It was so gory that it made me feel sick to my stomach, and my hands began to shake uncontrollably. "Where did you find this?" I stammered. "I didn't find it," she replied sobbingly. "My brother sent it to me just now, saying he found it in his car." The following week wasn't any better. It felt like a dark cloud hung over our truck depot. A co-worker named Ernest called a meeting while visibly shaking, pulling out copies of a news article that detailed the brutal murder of several people in another Arizona town. When we stopped at a diner on Route 66, fear settled all around us and sent chills down my spine. Neither of us could find the words to express the uneasiness that was growing inside of us. Over the course of the following few weeks, a pattern emerged where drivers would stop at seemingly innocent roadside diners and exits along route. How is this possible? Marjorie whispered in disbelief as she read the horrific article. I don't know, but we need to find out, I said, silently agreeing that it must be connected. As conversations among our truck driver groups heated up, 66 people would return to their trucks, only to discover unsettling pictures on their phones or inside their vehicles. Each time the mutilated parts belonged to a different victim but shared the same cruel treatment. An uncanny coincidence sent shockwaves through our community as a man appeared at the various crime scenes in recent news articles. The man, who was described as being over 6 feet tall and eerily smiling under a thick handlebar mustache, was seen lingering near the exit or diner, where the body parts were later discovered. One evening after I had delivered my cargo, a sense of dread came over me when I saw the figure outlined by moonlight standing just outside my truck. My heart began to race, and my instincts took over. Every fiber in my body told me that this man was the reason behind these horrific events. So, I grabbed my phone and took a picture of him before he vanished into the night. When I showed it to Marjorie and Nest, they were as horrified as I was, and we were able to see for ourselves how horrible this man really was. I knew that his intentions were anything but innocent when an anonymous text message appeared on my phone that said, "The others weren't enough. The others weren't enough. Your time will come." As the days passed, I became increasingly paranoid to the point where I dreaded ever getting back in my truck again. One night, as I pulled up to a stop, I couldn't get rid of the idea that I was also a target every time I looked in the mirror while parking my rig. I thought I could see his sinister grin. I couldn't bear the idea of going inside the diner alone, so I texted Marjorie and Ernest to ask them to join me. They hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, because we thought that being together might ward off the man's intentions, or at the very least make us feel safer. The diner seemed completely unassuming and wasn't closed or abandoned like some other diners. When they arrived, we sat in a booth by the window so we could monitor our trucks. We talked anxiously about the recent events and attempted to devise a strategy to defend ourselves against this smiling menace, but all we knew was that we had to remain together. As we were talking, I noticed an elderly woman listening in on our conversation. She appeared worried and approached us hesitantly, her voice shaking, saying, "I couldn't help but overhear your talking about that awful man." She continued by telling her that her grandson had told her about this man, who was notorious among truck drivers for being a sadistic killer who enjoyed playing violent games of cat and mouse with his victims and disfiguring their bodies after he captured them. Her information only made us more terrified and anxious about the situation, because it was obvious that we couldn't confront him head-on because he was too dangerous. We debated calling the police or even hiring private security to confront him directly, but none of us had any hard proof connecting him to the crimes beyond his persistent presence at every scene and our instincts, and we weren't sure if they would believe us or take our concerns seriously. Instead, we concluded that the only way to survive was to stay away from him as much as possible. After weeks of constant vigilance, one day it happened. I was stopped at a rest area to get some food and had just finished filling up my truck when Marjorie's screams rang out, and in a panic, I rushed towards her. We had started creating protocols among our fellow drivers for safety in numbers by parking close together in well-lit areas and keeping watch over each other's vehicles during pit stops. As we desperately attempted to keep Marjorie conscious long enough for paramedics to arrive, Ernest was nowhere to be seen. I felt a heavy knot form in my stomach, and the horrific scene inside her truck gnawed at my soul. She was barely alive, but horribly mutilated, obviously beaten and tortured by the man with the handlebar mustache. As she gasped for air, "Marjorie, choked out one last piece of news, that the man had taken Ernest and disappeared without a trace. We never saw Ernest again, but his absence served as a continual reminder of the horror we had encountered on those desolate sections of Route 66. Eventually, Marjorie passed away from her wounds, leaving us all devastated and afraid for our own lives. The smiling menace persisted in his reign of terror over the years, but he never directly returned to our lives. The guilt we feel for not being able to bring that monster to justice consumes me every day, but it serves as a constant reminder of what can happen when we let our guard down against such evil. May Marjorie and Ernest's memory live on as a testament. Once more, despite the nightmares that plagued us every night as we recounted these events, I hope to encourage others to remain vigilant and cautious on those dark roads where twisted evil can creep up without warning, to their bravery and strength in the face of this unimaginable horror. And may their spirits rest in peace, knowing that their fellow travelers did not forget them. It all started that night in Green Acres, a small, unremarkable town in Wyoming. My name is Brody Calloway, and I make a living by driving an 18-wheeler. Seen a lot of the country, which allowed me to see many strange things, but none like what I'm going to tell you. It was a foggy day, so thick that it seemed like nature was trying to discourage us from going outside, but I was used to driving my large rig through the dense fog. I arrived at the dilapidated warehouse close to the town's edge, where I occasionally delivered goods. Bob, the man who handles cargo, told me about the strange aura that has been hovering over the town lately. Most people blamed it on superstition, but Bob assured me that there were plenty of reasons to be concerned. You've heard about those disappearances lately, Bob said, scratching his scruffy beard. Before he continued, he said, "A couple of folks gone around here with no trace at all." I smirked dismissively, and we spent some more time unloading the cargo together after he said, "I think people just want some exciting gossip in this sleepy town." As we were talking, a commotion outside caught our attention. A disheveled woman rushed into the diner, her eyes wide with terror, and her breathing shallow and rapid. "He got him, that psycho got another one," she screamed, leaving everyone stunned and perplexed. The police quickly arrived and attempted to calm her down so they could get more details. Her name was Angela, and she told them how she had discovered what appeared to be a horrifying scene where her co-worker had been badly dismembered directly behind their office building. The authorities didn't waste any time in sending officers to search the area for leads or clues about the vicious assailant 4 days later. My next haul couldn't come soon enough. I couldn't wait to leave this morbid town in my rearview mirror and speed towards my next destination in California. After that horrific discovery, tension suffocated Green Acres, where everyone was terrified for their lives and every street was haunted by the elusive serial killer. Even as I loaded my truck, driving along the arid desert road, I hardly saw any other cars except the occasional tractor or pickup truck. As dusk approached and visibility dwindled, I felt uneasy because I knew that horrors might be lurking in the darkness just out of sight. As I rounded a particularly tight curve, I glanced briefly at the roadside where a rest area was approaching. Was marked immediately. To my utter horror, I saw a figure standing next to a mutilated body slumped close to a trash can. He was tall and thin, with long dark hair flowing down his back. A voice screamed as his heart pounded frantically in my chest and beads of sweat wet my forehead. The assailant made contact with me for what seemed like an eternity before jumping into his car to leave the scene. "Do you know if he got into a car?" the operator asked shakily. "Can you describe it?" "Oh yes," and I frantically answered, driving on autopilot while attempting to help law enforcement in any way I could. My hands trembled as I tried to dial 911, choking on breaths that seemed unwilling to make their way out of my throat. My dispatcher, Evelyn, stayed on the line to reassure me and make sure I stayed on course with the authorities as the situation worsened. I couldn't believe what was happening, so I stayed on the phone with Evelyn and the police, recounting the details of the grisly scene I had just witnessed. Police cruisers could be heard from miles away as they closed in on our location, their sirens piercing the silent night like a desperate cry for resolution. "Sir, could you please provide more details about what you saw and which direction the ascent fled in the officer?" I saw the officers arrive at the rest area quickly, their flashing lights casting eerie reflections on the surrounding desert landscape as they approached my truck. One officer signaled for me to roll down my window, while another approached the scene cautiously as he took down my information. I described the assassin's appearance and how he had made contact with me before he fled in his car. It was a white sedan, and I couldn't see the license plate clearly, but it might have started with AJ or AT. The officer nodded and relayed the information to other units, looking for the culprit over his radio. The officers led me to one of their cruisers, where they conducted additional interviews regarding my encounter with the ass. Meanwhile, his partner returned from examining the gory scene and discovered some evidence of a struggle. He informed us that the victim was gravely beyond help. I could see that they were trying to remain composed as they evaluated this horrific discovery, but I couldn't help but feel sorry for them. Despite being shaken by what I had seen, it felt good to give any information that could help bring this murderer to justice. A few days later, while driving along another empty highway in California, I finally received an update on the case. The police had apprehended the tall, dark-haired man and receiving a tip from a gas station. He was arrested by a station attendant who recognized the description and the car, and during the search of his house, they found evidence connecting him to several murders in Green Acres and along the highways I frequently traveled. Although I was relieved that he had been apprehended, my thoughts were with the victims and their families, because this one man's heinous acts had destroyed so many innocent lives, and coming so close to this nightmare had permanently altered me. Horrible crimes will always cast a shadow over the peaceful desert roads I used to drive on, thinking that, as long as I remained vigilant, nothing bad could happen to me. I'll cherish that brief encounter with the killer as a terrifying reminder that there are evils out there waiting to strike at any time. As I continue to make my hauls across the nation, I can't help but feel the atmosphere is different every time I walk through Green Acres or stop at almost any rest area. A creeping uneasiness has taken up residence in me, and I constantly look over my shoulder out of fear that history will repeat itself. The brutal assailant may have been apprehended and imprisoned, but the horrific reality he imposed on us will live in my memory for years to come, linger on his victims, those whose paths cross mine, albeit indirectly, at the hands of such a terrible fate. As I clutch my truck's wheel and return to the highway following another delivery, I offer silent words of both grief and hope for those who have been lost to terror and violence, as well as hope that we will one day succeed in our mission to eradicate such. I'm Ezekiel Tanner, and I've been a truck driver for more than 10 years, transporting cargo across the vast expanse of the United States. Life on the road can test your patience at times, but until then, I drive with eyes alert and a heart heavy with memories best forgotten, but never allowed to fade entirely. Nothing beats a good joke to kill time. Why did in my line of work? You learn to appreciate the little things. One memorable night, I was traveling to Kearney, Nebraska, with a load of farm equipment. With a big deadline approaching, there wasn't much time for pit stops. The sun had already set, and I asked anyone who would listen why the tomato turned red. I would respond with a laugh. The first indication that something was wrong was the sudden sound of sirens in the distance, as a police car sped past me in a blur of flashing lights, desperate to get somewhere quickly. It was an unusual sight out here a few miles away. I found myself on a particularly desolate stretch of highway, flanked by vast empty fields that seemed to stretch forever under the bright moonlight. I saw an overturned car on the side of the road with its occupants lying dead close by. It was a frightening sight that made me tighten my grip on my wheel. Soon after, I pulled into a rest area just outside Kearney, where there was only one working light and shadows everywhere. It was completely safe for a couple of people milling about, a family in their station wagon, and an elderly man looking at skyward was thinking thoughtfully, when I was abruptly awakened by the sound of sirens and blaring horns from the police cars that were coming in an emergency. Officers rushed out, trying to contain their terrified expressions, and I chose to approach them carefully, getting close enough to hear their terrified mutterings about someone wreaking havoc and horribly disfiguring their victims without leaving any important evidence behind. We were then led into the restroom building, where the older man identified himself as Morty Glassberg, a retired professor of linguistics, and spoke calmly as if attempting to ease the mounting tension in the room. Just as we began talking about what might have been happening outside, one of the officers began barricading the doors with wooden benches. My fellow travelers and I exchanged tense glances as fear gripped our hearts, heard scratching on the walls, followed by eerie tapping on the barricaded entrance. We held our breath, waiting for more noise, but silence arrived. Then, our brief respite was broken by an ear-piercing scream, and one officer went pale as he nervously peered out through a small crack in the barricade. "There's a man out there," he whispered, "and he has an axe, Morty." And as we watched in horror, I hurried to another window to get a better look at this enigmatic assailant. He was a tall, muscular, broad-shouldered man standing next to an abandoned truck wearing tattered clothes. His face was covered in filth, making it difficult to make out any features other than his eerie eyes, which seemed to pierce right through us with sinister intent. After a tense conversation with Morty and the family, we came up with what felt like our last hope, slipping out through a small rear window in one of the restroom stalls. Morty stumbled backward from the window, his face drained of color. We had little time left before he found a way inside. I knew we needed an escape strategy immediately. The family scrambled over the brick wall, trying not to let this monstrous person know where we were. Morty and I frantically made our way to an old storage shed in the hopes of finding something that would help us escape the growing nightmare. The father of the family attempted to call 911 on his cell phone, but there was no reception in this far-off place, so the mother searched frantically. We searched for anything that could be used as a weapon, but we could only find a rusty shovel and an old crowbar, so we decided to flee, with no other choice. We knew that maniac, who was carrying an axe, would eventually find us. We left the storage shed to look for one of the last parked cars in the area, and as we tiptoed across the grass-covered parking lot, there was a loud crash behind us. Our hearts raced, knowing that he would probably become more aggressive now that he knew we weren't trapped anymore. We continued to move quickly toward a dark blue sedan parked near some tall buildings. We were startled, like breaking glass, when we turned around and saw that horrible man smash through the window where we had been hiding earlier. He had found our escape. Trees. The father used his universal car opener to unlock the car, and we quickly climbed inside. The father expertly hotwired the car and put it in gear, so we could make a fast getaway. But as he accelerated the engine and drove away from our makeshift hiding place, I looked back and saw that frightful figure coming at us at full speed, swinging his axe wildly as we were thankful for the father's prompt action, as he was now driving us as far away from the rest stop as possible. We had no idea who this crazy person was, and every time I clenched my teeth with every deafening swing of that monstrous weapon against the pavement, my heart pounded like a drum in my chest, while my mind screamed at me to look back. But I couldn't help it. But we drove farther out of town before we could finally find cell phone reception and call the police. They responded with patrol cars, and after a tense few hours, we learned that the axe-wielding maniac had been captured. The officers told us that he had been responsible for a string of vicious attacks across the area, and commended our good judgment and close-knit teamwork for finally escaping his vicious intentions safely. But I will never forget the terrifying pictures of that night. I will never forget the family, especially the father who took command during those terrifying moments, or the bravery. Morty Guller's arrival was unquestionably a major factor in getting us out of harm's way when fear threatened to break our focus, demonstrated by every individually conquering crippling terror in the midst of chaos, serving as an unwelcome reminder of our common humanity in times of severe hardship and a testament to our resilience. The wounds on our hearts serve as a continual reminder to treasure our lives, because nobody can predict what will happen next. But knowing that we were able to escape as a truck driver, something so horrific only serves to increase our appreciation for life's beauty and its capacity for both darkness and light. I was taking a much-needed break from the long highways when my buddy Lee and I pulled over at Big Bob's truck stop just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. I was relieved but exhausted as we sat down for dinner at the nearby diner. Lee made a joke about the lamb meatloaf in front of us, looking suspiciously like Radkill from our previous stop. We laughed over it. At last, I was able to stretch my legs and eat something other than stale gas station hot dogs. The fluorescent lights flickered, which was annoying, but it was better than the stuffy confines of the truck. Nothing escaped him at this particular quirk of our work life. The waitress who served us had overheard these remarks and said, "You guys are truck drivers, right? Be careful on your route tonight." Lee asked, "What kind of accidents have taken place recently involving truckers?" "A few truckers have been found slaughtered in their sleeping cabs," explaining with an anxious expression that nobody knows what's going on or whose we finished our meal, and I couldn't help but glance at another driver nearby. He appeared to be traveling alone, but he didn't look any more dangerous than the typical trucker you'd meet in diners like this one. His eyes never left his plate, though, and he seemed to prefer solitude over small talk as we got back on the road. "It's pretty hoary," noted Lee replied solemnly, acknowledging the seriousness of her warning. As we drove into the night, I couldn't get rid of the uneasiness I had from hearing about those recent incidents. My hands gripped the wheel more tightly than usual, and soon after, we decided it was time to rest. We pulled into one of those makeshift rest stops along the highway in the hopes of getting a few hours of undisturbed sleep, but I had a knot in my stomach that prevented me from. I tried to convince myself that it was just nerves getting the better of me and tried to fall asleep late into the night, but something jolted me awake. The air felt tense and suffocating, and there was an unearthly silence. The truck seemed to be closing in on us, with faint wisps of fog creeping closer throughout the night. Lee was still asleep next to me when a loud bang reverberated through our cabin. I had not felt anything, but then I heard scraping sounds outside our truck, metal against metal, and my spine began to race. I looked out the window next to my bunk and noticed that the fog was thick, as if it were engulfing everything outside of our immediate area. Suddenly, a shadowy figure appeared. The man from the diner darted behind another parked truck in the distance. Panic struck when I noticed him brandishing a large weapon, either a machete or a cleaver, glinting with malice. I shook Lee back to consciousness and whispered urgently, "Let's wake up." For a brief moment, Lee appeared confused, but he quickly changed course. He quickly realized what was happening, so I whispered, "We need to call the police." We took out his phone and dialed 911, trying to keep our voices low so as not to attract any unwanted attention. "Hello, yes, we need help. We're at an AR rest stop off I-75, and a man brandishing a machete is stalking us. He's already attacked another truck. Please send help as soon as possible." We didn't have time to spare, so Lee whispered into the phone to give more information about our location. He then took our emergency flare out of the glove compartment and carefully opened the truck door, looking around for any signs of danger. He was determined to warn other truckers of their impending danger, so he managed to light the flare and waved it around without letting its light shine directly on him or our truck. Our hope that they would arrive soon was dashed when the man with the machete attacked one of the drivers who had come to witness the events. The man gave a blood-curdling scream before collapsing in a heap on the ground. The sudden light caused some drivers to get out of their cars and tried to understand what was happening. The police sirens started to sound in the distance, despite the fact that in emergency situations like this one, I should never call someone without permission, but lives were in danger at rest, so I grabbed my CB radio and began broadcasting over any open channels I could find. People rushed to their vehicles for protection as the assailant started slicing through anything in his path. Harmed when the police C cars finally arrived on the scene, officers positioned themselves behind their car doors, pointing their guns directly at the attacker. His movements were calculated and deliberate, but they also had an unsettling, chaotic edge. His face was partially covered by a bandana, but his eyes were narrow, cold, and full of unchecked rage. It sent shivers down my spine. He retaliated by attacking another trucker and slicing through the air with his weapon. One of them demanded it over the loudspeaker. The police officers fired several times in an attempt to bring him down without endangering anyone else, but he eventually fell to the ground, bleeding heavily. The police carefully moved to ensure his incapacitation before lowering their guard, and amazingly, no one was hurt. After that night, I couldn't help but think of that quiet man at Big Bob's Diner who carried a hidden darkness within him, a darkness he unleashed on an unsuspecting truck. We were questioned by detectives, who asked us for every piece of information we could remember about the man with the machete, even though two truckers were gravely injured and taken to nearby hospitals. As I idled my large rig at a desolate truck stop on the outskirts of Tucson, the moon loomed high in the sky, serving as a stark reminder to drivers that evil can lurk in unexpected places, and that we can never be too prepared or vigilant to protect ourselves and those around us. I'm Roger Wilkins from Arizona, and I've been driving trucks cross-country for more than 10 years. During that time, I've met a lot of weird people and had a lot of weird experiences, but none of them could ever match the horrific events that happened that fateful night. I was sitting there fiddling with the knobs on my CB radio when a man with a bushy beard and tattered clothes came up to my cab window and introduced himself. Terry introduced himself as Terry O'Connor and explained that his car had broken down just down the road. Normally, I wouldn't be willing to help a stranger at night, but Terry's kind manner made me feel comfortable, so I decided to offer him some help. I took my toolbox from behind the seat, and the two of us walked along the highway's edge toward his car, making some hilarious puns along the way, saying things like, "I guess you could say I'm having a lug nutty night." We kept talking and laughing despite what was about to happen. When we got to Terry's car, we saw what appeared to be blood streaks on the hood. However, it turned out to be oil mixed with radiator fluid, which could be an indication of engine failure. As we proudly opened the hood to look further, an unbearable stench blew out, and we discovered remains that suggested some unspeakable horror. Bloody. As we walked back toward my truck, talking about what we had seen, I noticed Terry's hands were shaking. Rags covered in what appeared to be human teeth were scattered among the engine parts, and we were unable to move or whisper any logical explanation for what lay before us. When we finally found our voices again, we both agreed not to report our gory discovery for fear of coming under suspicion ourselves. We heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the pitch-black darkness that engulfed the road. As the figure drew closer, we could make out the silhouette of a man wearing a long raincoat with a chilling grin plastered across his face. He must have sensed my gaze because he stammered an explanation. "I was in a bar fight a couple of days ago and my hand hasn't stopped shaking since. Doctor said it's just temporary. I hope they're right." Terry and I realized we were in serious danger as he drew closer and closer, his sinister smile growing with each step. Panic struck as we hurried into my truck to get out of this nightmare. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking more than just from nerves, now with adrenaline pumping through my veins. With a screech of tires, we peeled out of the truck, leaving the man in we were pursuing us at breakneck speed when Terry yelled, "Hey," over the roar of my engine. "That's him, that psycho is chasing us," As the raincoat far behind, my heart pounded against my chest and cold sweat soaked my skin. However, our ordeal wasn't over yet as we raced along the desolate highway and headlights appeared in our rearview mirror. The car veered erratically, narrowly, avoiding other traffic on the road. With our hearts racing, Terry and I continued to race down the lonely highway with our enigmatic pursuers still following closely. Every turn and curve on the road seemed to increase the tension of a rubber band nearing its breaking point. Our options were limited, and we couldn't risk drawing more attention by involving the authorities given our situation. The world turned into an endless chase scene as we attempted to outrun our tormentor through the night, barreling down highways and twisting rural roads at extremely dangerous speeds. Terry abruptly suggested that we take a detour into a hidden, overgrown path to try to avoid our pursuer, the truck stop. Although I was hesitant, I agreed that it was our best chance as we negotiated the narrow dirt road branches that scraped against the truck sides. We looked anxiously behind us, and our pursuer's headlights briefly disappeared. A gut-wrenching scream broke the silence as he soon reappeared, closing in on us faster than before. It dawned on Terry that he had followed us onto the dirt path and taken another life, but he was unable to bury his face in his hands as he desired, because they were too busy holding his trembling fists gripped at his lap. Terry just stared, a moment that would cost us dearly as our pursuer caught up in a last desperate attempt to flee. I floored the accelerator and drove towards a thick, dilapidated fence in the hopes of breaking through it. The vehicle slammed into it with tremendous force. I continued to accelerate at the truck's floor, navigating through various twists and turns until a sudden dead end presented itself. The maniac following us mirrored every move we made, his menacing grin haunting me as I barely managed to control my vehicle under such stressful conditions. It felt like an endless game of cat and mouse stretched beyond any reasonable limit as we sped to the construction site, where splintering wooden panels flew everywhere and it shattered under impact, giving us just enough room to continue. Sight. A huge, shaky-looking crane loomed in the distance, offering me a chance to make a risky move that might finally end the chase. I frantically gave Terry a quick rundown of my strategy and told him to brace himself before speeding full speed in the direction of the crane, veering off at the last second to avoid a catastrophic collision. Our evil pursuer was not as lucky. His car crashed into the crane's base with terrible force, causing the entire structure to collapse on him and his car in a roar of twisted metal and debris. Terry and I exchanged shocked looks before simultaneously letting out a sigh of relief that our ordeal, at least for the time being, appeared to be over. We got out of the truck. A day passed with no sign of any more disturbance or retaliation, and we cautiously approached the mangled remains of our pursuer's vehicle. Among the wreckage, we could see the man in his raincoat, now dead, his chilling grin extinguished forever. The nightmares remained vivid, but gradually subsided as each day went by, and the chilling memories, though never forgotten, started to fade as time passed. Terry's trembling hands gradually calmed down, just as his life and mind returned to some semblance of normalcy, although we would always feel guilty for not reporting our initial discovery at the truck stop. To this day, we cannot help but feel thankful that our lives had been spared by this unexpected turn of events, an extraordinary result born from unthinkable circumstances. It was supposed to be just another day at work for me, Russell Donovan, a truck driver who had witnessed it all. Up until I got to New Brunswick, a charming town in New Jersey, I had been traveling the country and visiting the most isolated places without giving much thought to what might be lurking nearby. He was remembered every day not only by us, but also by others affected by his atrocities. The inciting incident occurred a few hours into my delivery route. A car accident had closed the main highway 4 miles, forcing me to complete my deliveries on a winding country road. The scenery was breathtakingly eerie, but it was the grisly sight of a mutilated human body on the side of the road that brought my truck to a screeching halt. and my heart pounded wildly. Little did I know that this gig would change my life forever. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I climbed out of my truck, which was a severely disfigured corpse with chunks of flesh torn from its body and bones protruding at strange angles. I immediately dialed 911 in the hopes that someone would come investigate. But while I waited for the authorities to arrive, a pained scream echoed through the silent forest like a rusty iron door creaked open from a long-forgotten crypt. And, to my horror, there wasn't just one victim, it sounded like someone else needed help. I ran toward that agonized scream as quickly as my legs would allow, completely letting go of any fear for my own safety. That's when I discovered her, an old woman with torn clothes, covered in blood, and a look of sheer terror etched on her wrinkled face. We walked back to my truck, both of us looking around the area to try to avoid the vicious grip of our unseen attacker. The tense air seemed to cling to our very skin, and I could see her shivering, either from fear or the cold. Desperate gasps left her lips as she looked up at me with wide eyes and whispered, "He's here." The man, I don't know his name, instantly alert and on edge. As we staggered back toward the truck, I asked her, what did that man look like? She said that he had an abnormally large, muscular frame, mangled, twisted hair, and most hauntingly, black eyes that were soulless, as if they had no whites at all, just void. When he smiled, his teeth were sharp and jagged, capable of tearing flesh from bone. When we finally arrived at my truck, I assisted her inside the cab. I looked around for any sign of our attacker, but it was nearly impossible to see anything. In the pitch-black ocean of shadow, suddenly, footsteps sounded in the stillness, and the crunch of leaves and twigs gave me a new sense of terror. The elderly woman cried out, "Drive," and I briefly gasped for air. Our only chance of surviving was to speed away until we had left that horrible place far behind, racing down the road at reckless speeds. I fervently hoped we would escape whoever that monstrous man was, because even as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and heard the tires screeching against the gravel road, my mind was racing with a million questions about how many other victims had this man claimed. Would he find us and complete what he had begun? And would we even have a chance against someone like him? However, as I returned my focus to the road, ahead, a shadowy figure appeared directly in front of us, and I realized that there was no way out. With no other option, I swerved the truck just enough to avoid the monstrous man who was standing in the middle of the road. And as we passed him, I could feel the old woman and I exchanged terrified looks, but we remained silent out of fear that any sound would draw his relentless pursuit. The relentless terror drove us to speed deeper into the night in the hopes of losing him. But despite our frantic attempts to flee, it became more and more clear that he could always find us unsure of what to do next. Our days were turning into days with no end in sight, and I was terrified that our pursuer was closing in on our car. I longed for help, but I couldn't imagine who or how to call for help. Panic started to gnaw at our minds, and we were starving and exhausted from our futile attempts to outrun this man. With nothing but our desperation leading us through the darkness, we discovered a small roadside diner was packed with tired travelers who were relieved to see other people. We rushed inside, where we were confronted by a group of people near a booth. Ignoring my apprehension about talking to strangers, I blurted out what we had already experienced with this terrifying figure. The elderly woman also told her story in a frantic, and there were moments of silence before a burly man with gentle eyes, ash, and hair suggested that they assist us in facing this tormented soul together, believing that perhaps if we faced him, united as one force, we could put an end to his suffering. Desperate, she paced the diner's floor shakily with him, and they listened carefully as we described every torment inflicted upon us. Agony for good, weighing our options, and ultimately, agreeing with the plan, we set out as a group to return to the location where we had last seen the man. The atmosphere was tense as a small army of terrified souls assembled for a final stand, armed only with determination. Eventually, In the eerie darkness and silence of the night surrounding us, the twisted figure appeared before us once more, motionless as the ragged group of us started moving together like a broken unit, slow and unsteady, but determined, as we approached the grotesque villain menacingly twitching against the backdrop of shadows. It was frightening and sinister as before, and instead of attacking as planned, he hesitated almost imperceptibly for a moment, giving us an infinitesimal advantage, glimpse into the passionate chaos bubbling beneath his icy gaze. Taking advantage of this, a number of our unconventional unit members rushed around him, pinning his massive limbs down, while others restrained his tortured body. No one dared to look into his haunting eyes or approach those bone-chilling teeth, realizing that even in our strongest moments, any one of us was vulnerable. They worked tirelessly till the nightmare ended, when they used all of their filmy strength to subdue him and the darkness in his eyes faded. It was one of those stuffy summer afternoons in Charleston, South Carolina, when I felt confident that nothing could go wrong. I had been driving trucks for a good number of years, and my name is I.D. Bellon. Yes, I'm just an average guy with a menial job. But let me tell you what happened next. That day will always be etched in my memory. I had arrived at the distribution center to pick up my load and struck up a conversation with Roger, the dependable but elderly security guard. Little did we know that our light-hearted banter would soon be overshadowed by unanticipated terrors. "Hey Roger," I said, leaning over to get some coffee. "Remember when you said I would much rather watch the end of the world than see the Knicks win?" Roger laughed and said, "Yeah, what about it?" "Well, I heard they've got some talent coming in next season." I smiled and took a sip of my hot beverage as we laughed about the shortcomings of our favorite sports team. An odd feeling of forbiddance started to creep in from outside the small security booth. And that's when a man entered the busy floor of the distribution center. But he stopped suddenly close to Roger's desk before letting out a spine-tingling scream. His face twisted into an expression of pure terror, like someone watching their own death play out in front of them. However, what we saw was something much worse. An immobile mass scattered across the floor next to our. Not only was the office covered in gore, but it appeared as though someone had been dismembered by a merciless machine. Roger muttered to himself as he hurried into action and radioed for assistance, while the other employee stared in horror, frozen in shock, and I stood there with coffee cups still gripped in my hand, unable to comprehend the whims of fate that had been hurled upon us in the ensuing chaos. And we were blind to a tall figure that interrupted the scene. Clad in grim-stained clothing and brandishing a blood-soaked machete, his demeanor suggested that he took advantage of our suffering. He was evil personified, a force bound by an unquenchable desire for chaos and agony. I watched as this monstrous creature approached Roger, who was still before going silent. The intercom emitted jumbled cries of terror and confusion. I wondered, why won't anyone hear us? Who is this malicious creature that has been infiltrating our sanctuary? The perpetrator viciously attacked, according to Roger, and somehow his unhinged laughter reached new heights as he mutilated the guard's lifeless body relentlessly. Abject fear gripped my very being. With my clothes soaked in perspiration, I prayed to God to help me escape this living hell. Suddenly, I had the thought, I'll run for one of the trucks and use it to escape from this malevolent force. My heart pounded as I ran through the maze of tall semi-trucks, the antagonist pursuing closely behind, dragging his gore-soaked weapon. With obvious excitement, I was able to get into one of them, was trying desperately to start the engine while trying not to choke on fumes that clawed at my eyes and throat. Another nightmarish tackle echoed through the air, and then boots pounded against metal, a relentless beast hunting its prey. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened, when he ignited a blood-stained firebomb and threw it at the windshield with malicious intent. Flames licked at my feet. Of the chaos all around me, I was able to start the truck. We were only a few more steps away from escaping this monstrous nightmare, but the engine sputtered as though it were defying the urgent call to action. The terrifying assailant drew closer, his unrelenting laughter resonating in my ears. "Come on, you have to move," I yelled at the truck, my frustration erupting inside of me with one last when the engine roared to life. I slammed on the gas and screamed out of the parking lot, barely avoiding his swinging machete as it whistled through the air. I drove at breakneck speed, only thinking about myself and my survival. I had no idea where I was going and kept driving until when I saw a small police station up ahead. I felt hopeful that perhaps they could do something about this monstrous person. I rushed into the precinct and frantically called for assistance, and the officers there listened carefully as I described what had happened at our workplace. The gory details poured forth with every word, and their expressions changed from disbelief to grim recognition. I saw him, one officer said solemnly, with a look in his eyes that confirmed my worst fears. This attacker was not new to them. They knew who he was and what he had done before the phone rang in the background as one of my former co-workers entered the police station. He described how he had escaped during the attack and called emergency services, and the task force was formed. The air was heavy with tension and fear as we hurried back to the bloodbath at our workplace. As we turned into the parking lot, immediately, a group of heavily armed officers readied themselves for battle with an impeccable air of resolve among themselves. They chose not to reveal much about our attacker, but their silence spoke volumes about the impending danger ahead. I saw that the monstrous creature had vanished, but his presence persisted in the bloodstains and disfigured bodies of my friends and co-workers. The task force courageously entered the building with the intention of apprehending this heinous killer, and the police searched every square inch of the building, but they could find no sign of him. Hours went by without providing me with any information regarding the whereabouts of our attacker. I was told that even though many murders had been committed in a similar manner in the past, this person had always eluded capture, and all of their suspicions pointed to the same conclusion. This vicious killer would strike again soon enough, with no new information or leads. We were told to return home because our workplace was still regarded as an active crime scene, with bloody mangled bodies, and our predator, who remained unnamed and was a dangerous man with twisted motivations, who left an endless string of victims in his gory way, left pools of blood throughout the building. Seeing the horrific atrocities committed that day left my life forever altered, and I will never forget the faces of my fallen co-workers. As for the monstrous man dressed in filth who saved my life that day, I would never really be free as long as he was not captured. After another exhausting day of driving across the nation making deliveries, I ended up parked at a truck stop close to Topeka, Kansas. It never ceases to amaze me how vast this country is when you're driving it every day. Weary from my long days on the road, I made the decision to stretch my legs and grab her as I sat down next to him at the counter. He said, "Hey buddy," another truck driver named Carl Murphy. "You look beat up, rough day behind the wheel." "You have no idea," I replied with a smirk. But as we continued our conversation and exchanged more anecdotes and trucker rumors, I noticed that old black and white pictures of previous while striking up a conversation with Kyle and our waitress Susie. We ended up talking about a recent news article about a string of violent attacks in Toka over the past few weeks. There were rumors that these incidents were carried out by some kind of crafty man who preyed on lone individuals, especially at night. The Seatone memories gave the place an eerie charm that never ceased to fascinate me. Hours later, Carl's voice faded away as I turned my focus to an oddly dressed man entering the diner, clad in layers of mismatched, tattered clothing and moving with an awkward gait. He was an unsettling presence among the cheery atmosphere of truckers and people going out at night. I casually dismissed those stories as just another urban legend made up to keep people on their toes. I said goodbye to Kyle and Sue and went back to my cab for a well-earned sleep. The thought of that strange man was in the back of my mind, but I put my uneasiness down to the grisly gossip we'd been discussing. For some reason, it felt like those piercing eyes behind an untidy beard were closely observing me. Susie waved when she saw me and came over smiling, saying, "Hey there. I was just cleaning up after last night, and I found this note under a pile. I woke up early the following morning and went back into the diner for a quick breakfast before heading back out. The crowd had thinned and sunlight was streaming into the windows, eliminating any lingering spooky feelings from the previous night. Of napkins, I took the paper from her, unfolded it, and saw a string of hurriedly scrawled words that did not leave me furrowing my brow in confusion. I showed it to Susie and asked her if she knew anything about it, and she shook her head, stating that it must have been left by one of the customers during the night shift. Despite her casual response, I couldn't help but feel more uneasy because I was still reminded of the unnerving visitor from last night. My anxiety increased when I remembered what this note said and went back to my truck. I saw some scratches on the outside of it that hadn't been there before, and there was an unidentifiable, foul stench coming from close to my cab. My heart was racing as I thought about last night's encounter with that strange man. Was he responsible for this terrifying warning? I briefly considered my options. Should I report this to the police, or should I just dismiss it as a prank and continue traveling? The more I considered it, the more I understood that reporting it could come across as overly cautious or paranoid, since there was no hard proof that any crime had been committed, and all I had was some scratches on my truck and a foreboding note. Reluctantly, I decided to disregard the warning, but to be more watchful in case anything else occurred. As I ate breakfast, I watched the diner's entrance to make sure the enigmatic man from the night before didn't reappear. I then left the diner and got ready to drive again. But unlike most days, I found myself closely examining my surroundings and my heart rate rising because I felt anxious about my thoughts. I hesitated for a second before telling him what had happened last night and showing him the note. But then a fellow trucker interrupted me and said, "Hey there," he said. "You seem pretty jumpy this morning." The trucker raised an eyebrow before saying, "You know what, maybe you should report this to someone. Is that guy is still around here causing trouble? It might be." After exchanging contact details with the fellow trucker in case we needed to get in touch later, I headed back to the diner to report the disturbing events that had occurred. Sue listened intently as I told her everything that had happened since our conversation last night. And while this confirmed my own worries, it also offered a chance for support if things got any worse. Before we could decide how to proceed, she asked if she should call her manager or the authorities. Her happy demeanor changed to one of genuine concern. A loud crash came from outside the diner, and we hurried outside to see that my truck's tires were all slashed and that a small fire had started underneath it. People inside the diner started to leave as the fire got bigger, while others made frantic attempts to put it out, while we waited for law enforcement to arrive and assess the situation. I couldn't help but think about that strange man from last night and the note warning me not to leave. The firefighters arrived in record time and managed to contain the fire before it could cause any more damage to the surrounding area or harm anyone. Authorities were also called because this was no longer just simple vandalism, but rather an active threat to everyone's safety. I told the police everything that had happened since last night, highlighting my interaction with the unsettling man and even my fellow trucker's support. They took the note as proof and urged me to keep in touch with them in case anything else strange happened with my truck, which was out of commission because of the serious damage caused by the fire and scratches to the dam. I was forced to stay at her. A few days went by with no sign of that enigmatic man or any other strange incidents, but the police remained visible in and around the area as they looked into what had happened. By coincidence or accident, Susie and the other trucker made sure to check up on me during this time, offering both emotional support and company during meals until it could be repaired. As I started the engine again and got ready to go, I couldn't help but glance back at the diner. It appeared that my refusal to dismiss these incidents had resulted in increased security, possibly preventing more incidents from happening. Eventually, A morning came when my truck repairs were finished and I could resume my journey. Saying goodbye to Susie and my fellow trucker was bittersweet after everything we'd been through together. I'm Tucker Johnson, a truck driver by trade and one of my least favorite people that had suddenly turned into a place of danger and support in such a short time. As I drove down the highway, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease, wondering if I'd ever encounter that unknown figure again. There was also gratitude for the friends I had made during this ordeal, and a renewed appreciation for the community we truckers share out on the open road. The only thing I usually looked forward to while driving this stretch was the truck stop about halfway between both cities. It's nothing major, just a place with fuel pumps, restrooms, and a grill where I could grab a bite to eat. However, the long hours and lack of human contact would cause any person's mind to wander. On this particular trip, I had just arrived at the truck stop. It was well past midnight, and as usual, there weren't many other cars hanging around. I parked my large rig at a gas pump and went outside into the cold night air. As I filled up, I looked around at my fellow late-night travelers and noticed two men standing suspiciously by a dark green van, smoking cigarettes. Their faces hidden by hoodies and easy vibes made me watch them closely. As I finished up at the pump, I walked into the truck stop's convenience store, where the tired-looking cashier gave me a half-hearted nod while talking on her phone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw some activity in front of the men's restroom. A poor guy was sprawled on the floor, bruised and blooded, clutching his side in agony. Despite my desire to assist in this situation, no one else seemed to care, so I chose not to do so either. Even though I felt sorry for the injured man, because I had learned from experience that it's best not to get hurt, the man left him there in a daze and walked away casually, as if nothing had happened. His leather jacket creaked with every step he took, and one hand twitched above his back pocket, as if hiding something deadly within its folds. Involved when traveling through this region of the world, I went to the grill area and waited for my plate of eggs and bacon. As I waited, two hooded men entered the room and began talking in low voices, hardly making eye contact, about something that made them tense. Sweat trickled down their furrowed brows, and even in the cold of the night, when my food arrived, I chose to use one of the old boo tucked away. While eating my oily meal in the corner, I couldn't help but listen to their conversation, which seemed to hint at something much more sinister than Shady's last-minute deals gone south. They said, "We messed up really bad. We got to do something tonight." And the other person replied, "We can't wait any longer. He'll come for us 3 days." Upon realizing that I had caught a glimpse of their conversation, they abruptly shifted to an interesting subjects, like the sports score and their dinner plans. I swallowed a stubborn mouthful of overcooked bacon, and my heart raced with newly discovered adrenaline. This was not a normal conversation between truckers or people just passing by. These men were obviously creating a dangerous, so much so that even their knowing glares begged me to realize that I was now a possible witness. Suddenly, another incident occurred somewhere behind me, causing crushing yelps of pain. Before I could use the men's restroom again, a blood-curdling scream interrupted my thoughts, and my stomach churned with both fear and disgust at the grisly mess that was probably only a few meters away. "Hey man," one of the hooded figures abruptly spoke toward me, his voice filled with fear as he slammed his fist gently against his legs and said, "Help me take this outside." He had just finished speaking when the heavy-set man returned from the disturbance, and he glided past the hooded men like a ghost, looming over me with a sinister smile on his face and cold, calculating eyes. His brawny build and menacing glare made it clear that resistance was futile, even though I desperately wanted to call for help or just run away, knowing that doing so would only lead to my capture or worse. Now that it was clear that he was the one coordinating whatever wicked plan had been put into motion, he gestured for me to follow him to the back where the commotion had occurred earlier. Witness the cause of the earlier disturbance. The injured man, now unconscious and restrained in a chair, appeared to have been severely beaten. with blood streaming down his face, and his breathing harsh and labored. I tried my best to ignore the violent scene in front of me and kept planning how to escape this situation without drawing too much attention to myself or running the risk of getting hurt. But it seemed impossible until I heard sirens wailing in the distance. The sirens grew louder and closer until it was clear they were going straight for us. The heavy-set man panicked and quickly dragged me into a hidden room in the back of the diner. His face was visibly tense, and the villainous figure whispered something urgent to one of his hooded accomplices, who fled without protest. In what seemed like an eternity, but could only have been a few minutes, law enforcement officers barged into the building, their commanding yells echoing through the walls as they captured the men who had held me captive. Feeling safe in their presence, I pushed past my captor and ran for safety. The police officers took command immediately. As I described everything I had seen, it became clear that I had unintentionally become involved in a poorly executed kidnapping plot. The injured man was a well-known businessman, and the motive behind it all was money. It was so basic and brutal, but who could have predicted that a routine stop at a roadside diner would lead to this? Could contain such horrors. It would undoubtedly be ingrained in my memory for a very long time. I couldn't have imagined what was going to happen when I pulled into the small, dingy gas station off the side of the highway in Arana, Texas. My name is Edmund Keating, and I've been a truck driver for more than 20 years. It's not glamorous. Work, long hours, bad food, and too many miles of empty road, but it has its moments. As the sun started to set behind the horizon, I was captivated by the way it tinted the sky with shades of pink and orange. The air felt cool as the day gave way to night, and before I entered, I noticed a thin layer of dust on my windshield that had been building up during my trip. "Hey Edmund," I heard Carter yell from under the hood of the truck we were driving. The gas station was run down on the outside, but it felt even worse inside, with dimly lit shelves filled with dusty goods, and that one lone attendant behind the counter reading a comic book while perusing some snack options. He and I had been like brothers for years, and it looked like we might have a minor problem with the coolant system. I nodded and went inside to take a look, shifted to an old TV set in the corner that showed breaking news about a serial killer. At large, authorities advised residents to stay indoors because the killer, who had no name yet, was tall, lanky, and wore a strange hat that covered most of his face. His most recent victim was a Cy Maldonado, whose car was discovered burned just outside of town last week, and the police suspected she had wandered into her as authorities were still searching for Sailant's remains after she was brutally dismembered while attempting to flee a stalled vehicle. I felt uneasy as I grabbed my can of cool soda and beef jerky and went back outside. Carter had fixed the coolant system, but now that menacing report weighed heavily in the air in some places, like this dubious service station, one's imagination can run wild when there are miles of empty road, and boy was I ever nervous. "Come on, let's get back on the road," I said, trying to ignore my worries, but as we were about to leave, a mudcake pickup truck slid into an empty pump slot with a real and strong smell of burned rubber. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to see the driver because the truck's windows were excessively tinted. It wasn't until that individual got out of the car that I noticed something that made my spine tingle. A tall, lanky man with a strange hat that mostly covered his face. With my heart racing, I threw Carter my snacks and threw him into the truck. I then barked urgently, "We need to get out of here," and he jumped into the cab with me. We ran away from that gas station without turning around, and neither of us dared to speak as our headlights cast eerie shadows on everything in their path. I drove the truck recklessly through countless empty streets that seemed to go on forever, and every turn felt like it had brought us closer to the terrifying figure that was lumbering toward us. My hand shook as I started the engine, and smoke billowed from the tailpipe. While Carter frantically looked for a weapon, he found a nearly empty can of pepper spray stashed inside our glove box. "Prepare yourself," I growled and abruptly whipped the truck around a corner, certain doom. The sound of another vehicle emerging broke our silence and caused our tires to screech, breakneck speed, causing panic to run through our veins. As the headlights of our pursuers rounded the sharp corner, leaving the smell of burning rubber in our wake, Carter heroically leapt out into the open and sprayed their windshield in the hopes that a road blast would thwart their hunt. It seemed like we had been driving 4 hours on end, with each minute passing as slowly as the last, and the fear that had seized us since our encounter with the strange as our truck screeched to a halt. I saw a figure emerge from a nearby brush. It was the tall man we had previously detected, standing nearly 7 feet tall and wearing filthy clothes. Carter slammed on the brakes dead end, screaming in panic. We both knew that calling for help wouldn't help much because we were in the middle of nowhere and it would take too long for anyone to reach us. With nowhere left to run, we jumped out of the truck, desperate for any way out of this monster of a human being. His eyes were dark black holes that threatened to swallow any hope for sanity from our minds. His lanky frame moved in an unnatural manner, with each motion jerky and uncoordinated. His clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in months. As he drew closer, I couldn't help but notice his as we drew farther away from our insane pursuer. My heart hammered in my ears as we tried to avoid branches and debris that would slow us down or trip us up. The fear of being discovered made us feel desperate and fleet, and in a brief moment of luck, I saw an abandoned house through the trees. My hands were blistered and bloody from what felt like endless torment as we raced toward our chance at salvation. I shouted to Carter, decrepit exterior giving me a shred of hope over here. As soon as we entered the house, I slammed the door shut behind us and swiftly locked it, and before we started frantically looking for anything that could be used as a barricade or protection against our oncoming pursuer, we heard heavy footsteps on the decaying porch outside, and I shuddered knowing that this brutish man wouldn't. Carter abruptly yelled from the windows as I started to assemble makeshift weapons, an old rusted pipe, a broken chair leg, but it would have to do until he had hurt us all. Worse, kept a watch on the windows. He's attempting to enter through the window on the opposite side of the room. So I spun about in time to witness the terrifying scene of a blood-stained hand frantically scratching at the broken glass. I hurled myself at our invader Pip as the window broke. Clutching him with I swung it as hard as I could into his twisted with the strength of adrenaline, cranium causing him to temporarily back off. This fleeting victory offered, we had enough time to get out of that miserable place and jump out. We entered the backyard through a different window as our assailant started beating on the locked front door. We ran back as a clamor reverberated ominously through the night air toward our truck and made it there without any further problems. Fortunately, it was still there when we departed. When our engine came to life earlier, we made a desperate attempt to escape. I looked at Carter once more before looking into the rearview mirror with a feeling of I felt a wave of relief as we drove quickly away from that nightmare as our pulse returned to normal as dawn dawned on a new day. And we promised never to talk about what had happened to us. How can anyone possibly comprehend how accurate it is? This event had been unpleasant and terrifying, but we had survived something. It would be an understatement to say that we survived the unspeakably terrible death defying a life. Our lives must continue, yet in my heart, every dimly lit street constantly brings to mind that terrifying experience out on those lonely roads of the strange man who almost cost us everything with his relentless pursuit. Everything he